The lecture of today is the applied anatomy of the T.M. joint, the temporomandibular joint. This lecture is concerned with the anatomy and applied anatomy of this important joint. It is a synovial type of joint containing a space, joint cavity, and located anterior to the tragus of the external ear in the lateral side of the face bilaterally. This temporomandibular joint consists of the articulation happens between three important bony surfaces. The first one, the mandibular fossa in the skull, as seen here in this picture. The second surface is the tubercle of the temporal bone, called the articular tubercle, from the squamous part of the temporal bone, as seen here in this picture. And also the lateral the third bone or third part of the articulation is by the head of the mandible. So the head of the mandible, as seen here in the blue color, the mandibular fossa, and the articular tubercle of the squamous part of temporal bone. These three bony landmarks is the articulating surface of the T.M. joint. The unique feature of this temporomandibular joint is the presence of intra-articular fibrocartilaginous disc, and this disc will split the space or the joint cavity into two compartments or two parts, the superior compartment and the inferior compartment of the joint. And each part or compartment is lined by a synovial membrane. So the joint space is in two portions, present in two portions. This unique feature will give more mobility and specific movements for the T.M. joint. We will come in this next slide to describe that. These bony articular surfaces, they are covered by fibrocartilaginous covers. Despite it is a synovial joint, but it is atypical synovial joint because the articular bones are covered by fibrocartilage instead of hyaline, and the second point we have what is called intra-articular fibrocartilaginous disc. Okay, now the ligaments, as we mentioned in the previous lectures, that each joint in the body has factors of stability, including muscular factors, bony factors, and ligamentous factors. So the ligaments concerning with the stability of the T.M. joint are the following ligaments. The first one is the lateral one in the green color here, between the articular tubercle and the mandibular neck of the mandibular bone. It is in actual fact a thickening of the lateral part or portion of the capsule of the T.M. joint, and this will act to prevent the posterior dislocation of the T.M. joint. So this is one of the important ligaments stabilizing the joint. The second ligament include the sphenomandibular ligament, seen in the blue color, extending between the sphenoid spine and the mandible, and is also stabilize the joint and give a strength support to the joint. The other is the stylomandibular ligament, and from its name, between the styloid process and to the angle of the mandible. And actually, it is a thickening of the fascia of the parotid region. You know, the parotid fascia is part of the deep fascia of the neck, investing layer, extending between the mastoid and the styloid to the angle of the mandible. At this point, this fascia will be thickened, forming a ligament-like structure called the stylomandibular ligament, serving for stability and support of the TM joint. Now, the movement of the TM joint, as we mentioned, it has a unique feature and composed of the joint space composed of two compartments, and this configuration will give more specific movements and function, and the movements of the joint produced by a group of muscles called the muscles of mastications. And actually the important movement of the TM joint is to help in the mechanism of mastication, or even what is called the mechanical digestion in the food in the mouth or in the oral cavity. Now the two compartments of the joint has two different function or movements. For example, in the upper compartment of the joint cavity, we have the following movement: the protrusion and retraction of the TM joint. So it happens at the upper compartment, superior compartment of the joint, and this will allow the mandible to protrude and retract, and this will caused by the following muscles, mainly the lateral pterygoid muscle causing protrusion. The medial pterygoid muscle also share and participate in the protrusion of the mandible during its contraction, and the posterior fibers of the temporalis muscle will perform the opposite movement, which is the retraction of the mandible. So protrusion and retraction of the mandible is a movement at the superior compartment by these three muscles, pterygoids and temporalis muscle. The movement or the function called chewing or grinding of the food, chewing and grinding of the food, achieved by alternating movement between protrusion and retraction of the mandible sequentially and continuously. Protrusion and retraction, this will give a specific function for chewing of the food and grinding of solid food like beans and so on. Now the other movements occurs at the lower compartment of the joint, and this will permit an elevation and depression of the mandible, and this will cause opening and closing the mouth. So the depression is mostly by the gravity, and sometimes if there is a resistance to the opening of the mouth, the following muscles will help in depression of the mandible: the digastric muscle, mostly the anterior belly of digastric, and the geniohyoid muscle and the mylohyoid muscle. The suprahyoid muscle will pull the mandible downward and cause depression and opening of the mouth, while the elevation movement is more powerful, caused by the contraction of the temporalis muscle, the masseter muscle, and the medial pterygoid also participate in closing the mouth. So these are the movements happens at the lower compartment of the TM joint. We reach to the blood supply and nerve supply of the joint. Actually, it is a vascularized joint, mainly by branches of external carotid, particularly the superficial temporal artery here in the picture. It will give the twigs to the nutrient artery, to the bones, to the capsule, and to the intra-articular structures. And the other contributing branches comes from deep auricular artery, ascending pharyngeal artery, and other branches from this maxillary artery, which is the terminal branch of the external carotid artery in this infratemporal fossa. Now the nerve supply of the joint comes from or by the auriculotemporal nerve and the masseteric nerves, which are branches of the V3, the third division of trigeminal nerve, which is named the mandibular nerve, which is motor and sensory to the muscles of mastication as a motor, and to the joint, for example, as a sensory to the joint, and also to the motor to the muscles that act on the TM joints, as we mentioned it in the previous two slides. We come to the last slide of the lecture, and of course containing some clinical relevant points, like the common conditions which might happen, which calls the TM joint dislocation. The temporomandibular joint dislocation. The common type of dislocation is the anterior dislocation, because the posterior is almost prevented by a presence of tough ligaments and strong muscle, and even the bony factor will prevent the posterior dislocation. So the anterior dislocation, it can happen via the external trauma, like a blow on the lateral side of the TM joint, and sometimes during yawing, severe yawing, excessive opening of the mouth, or sometimes during taking a large and strong bite of the food, for example, and this will cause a movement of the head of the mandible outside of the mandibular fossa here, and moved out like this right here. So here is the head of the mandible is outside the joint limitation. So the head will slips outside, and this will called the dislocation of the anterior dislocation of the TM joint. The patient will be unable to retract, to close the mouth, which is very painful, and sometimes the nerves around the head of the mandible, like the auriculotemporal nerves, will be damaged and compressed by the dislocated head of the mandible. So in this picture we can see the simple and skillful maneuvers to relocate the dislocated TM joint. Although we have spasm and contraction of the muscles due to the dislocation, we can give the patient some medications to be more relaxed, and this will help reduction and relocation by this maneuver, pushing the lower jaw down and back, and you will hear a click when the head of the mandible will be returned back to the normal mandibular fossa. You will hear a click, which means that the joint is relocated and the patient can close his mouth normally. This is what we have about the TM joint, and I hope you get the important points regard, and thanks. Goodbye.